Danny Carson stood in the center of the grand hall and tried not to shake too much as hundreds of alien eyes watched him from every direction. Some with curiosity and others with something that looked like hunger or contempt. The Galactic Council chamber was enormous, far larger than anything he had seen back on Earth, or even on the transport ships that brought survivors like him to different stations across known space. And the ceiling stretched so high above that he could barely see where it ended in the dim light that filtered down through windows made of materials. He did not recognize he was 12 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that hung loose on his thin frame, because he had lost weight over the past year and nobody had thought to get him new ones that fit properly. The jacket he wore was too big. An old military jacket that someone had given him because his own had been destroyed. And on the chest of that jacket hung a simple silver medal with a blue ribbon that caught the light. Whenever he moved, his hands wanted to shake, but he forced them to stay still at his sides, the way Lieutenant Morrison had taught him during those brief minutes before everything changed forever. And he kept his chin up, even though his throat felt tight and his eyes burned with tears. He refused to let fall. Queen Shlara of the Vakros Empire towered over everyone in the chamber, her reptilian form covered in scales that shimmered between green and gold. And her eyes were large and unblinking, as they fixed on Danny with an intensity that made him want to step backwards. She was famous across the galaxy for her military campaigns and for the ruthless way she expanded her empire's borders, conquering species after species with calculated precision. And most beings in the chamber feared her, or at least respected the threat she represented. Ambassador Claire Bennett stood near the human delegation section, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly together as she watched Danny with obvious worry, because she had tried to stop this impromptu session, but the council protocols gave the Queen the right to question any visitor who caught her attention. Commander Vex of the Ctherian warrior clans sat in the Predator section of the chamber, his scarred face showing interest as he leaned forward slightly. And his species were known throughout the galaxy as fierce hunters who valued strength above all else, and showed no mercy to those they considered weak. Council Elder Mortek, an ancient being whose species Danny could not identify, sat at the highest seat and looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. But he had been forced to allow this questioning because Queen Shlara had invoked an old council law that permitted challenges to honor and valor. The session had been peaceful until an hour ago. Just another diplomatic gathering where different species discussed trade agreements and border disputes. But then Queen Shlara had noticed Danny in the observation gallery where the survivor delegation from Earth Colony 7 was watching the proceedings. She had stopped mid-sentence during her own presentation about military cooperation and pointed directly at Danny, demanding to know why a human child wore military honors when humanity had been part of the galactic community for barely 3 years and had fought no significant wars. The question had created an immediate stir because it suggested that humans were lying about their achievements or falsifying military records to gain respect they had not earned. And several predatory species had taken up the challenge with enthusiasm because they enjoyed any opportunity to humiliate newer species. Ambassador Bennett had tried to explain that the medal was legitimately earned and that Danny's service record was verified. But Queen Shlara had dismissed her words and demanded to hear directly from the boy himself. Now, Danny stood in the center of the chamber floor, brought down from the gallery by council guards who had been surprisingly gentle as they escorted him. And he could feel the weight of all those alien gazes pressing down on him like a physical force. Some species in the chamber looked sympathetic, their large eyes soft with concern, but others looked amused or dismissive, as if watching a child try to explain adult matters would provide entertainment. The relaxed delegation, another predatory species known for their brutal hunting practices, whispered among themselves and made sounds that might have been laughter, though it came out as clicking and hissing that echoed through the chamber. Danny had been visiting Nexus Prime Station with other survivors, part of a program that Ambassador Bennett had organized to show the galaxy what humanity had endured during various attacks on their colony worlds. But he had not expected to be singled out like this. His heart hammered in his chest, so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it, and his mouth felt dry as sand. But he remembered what his mother had always told him about standing up straight and speaking clearly, even when he was afraid. Queen Shlara descended from her seat with movements that were both graceful and threatening, each step deliberate as she approached Danny until she stood directly in front of him, close enough that he had to tilt his head back to see her face. "You are a child," she said, and her voice resonated through the chamber like thunder, deep and commanding. "Yet you wear the mark of a warrior, a decoration that my own soldiers must earn through blood and sacrifice." Danny swallowed hard but did not look away from her eyes, even though every instinct told him to run or hide or do anything except stand there under her scrutiny. "Explain to this council," Queen Shlara continued, and now her voice carried an edge of accusation that made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "What possible deed could earn one so young such an honor?" She paused, letting the silence stretch out until it became almost unbearable. And then she leaned down slightly so her face was closer to his. "Or admit that your species falsifies valor to claim respect it has not earned. That you give medals to children for nothing more than existing while braver species fight real battles." The chamber erupted in murmurs and excited chatter, some species clearly agreeing with the Queen's challenge, while others seemed offended by the accusation. But Elder Mortek struck his staff against the floor 3 times, and the noise subsided into expectant silence. "The human child may speak," Elder Mortek announced, though his voice carried reluctance. "Council protocol requires that any being questioned must be given opportunity to respond." Ambassador Bennett started to move forward, clearly intending to speak on Danny's behalf. But Elder Mortek raised one hand to stop her. "The Queen has invoked personal challenge. The child must answer for himself." Danny felt all the air leave his lungs in a rush, and for a moment he thought he might faint right there on the chamber floor. But then he felt the weight of the metal against his chest and remembered Lieutenant Morrison's face in those last minutes before the tunnel. He remembered Katie's small hand gripping his arm, and he remembered the sounds of plasma fire echoing through the shelter. And he remembered crawling through absolute darkness with only one thought keeping him moving forward. He took a breath, and then another, and when he spoke his voice came out steadier than he expected, quiet but clear enough to carry through the silent chamber. "My name is Danny Carson," he said, looking up at Queen Shlara without blinking. "I lived on Earth Colony 7 with my family. 3,000 humans on a world designated for peaceful agricultural development." He paused, gathering his thoughts, and his hand moved unconsciously to touch the metal on his chest. 80 months ago, our colony was attacked by Vroken mercenaries who wanted our mineral deposits. They came without warning and with no intention of taking prisoners. The chamber remained absolutely silent now. Every being focused on the small human boy who stood alone in the center of the floor. And even the predatory species had stopped their dismissive sounds. "My father died in the first attack," Danny continued, and his voice remained steady even though his hands had started to shake again. "He was defending the research station where he worked. My mother died helping evacuate children to the underground shelters." Queen Shalara's expression had not changed, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been interest or calculation, and she remained perfectly still as Danny spoke. 300 children made it to the primary shelter," Danny said, and now his voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper that somehow still carried through the vast chamber. "But the Vrokins found us. They were cutting through the doors and we had nowhere else to go. He looked around at the faces watching him. Alien and strange, but suddenly very attentive. There were only 12 adults left alive in the shelter with us, he said. And they had to make a choice that no one should ever have to make. Danny's voice remained steady as he continued his explanation. Though inside his chest, his heart felt like it might break apart all over again. The way it had broken in that dark shelter when he realized what the adults were planning to do, the council chamber stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. And even Commander Vex had stopped leaning back in his seat and now sat forward with genuine interest, replacing his earlier contempt. Earth Colony 7 was beautiful, Danny said, letting his mind go back to those days before everything turned dark and terrible. We had fields of wheat and corn that stretched for kilometers. And my mother grew vegetables in her garden that she said tasted better than anything from Earth itself. He could see it all so clearly in his mind. The way the two suns would set over the western hills and paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. And the way the wind would carry the smell of growing things through the open windows of their small house. My little sister Katie loved to collect flowers, Danny continued, and his voice softened with memory. She was 8 years old, and she had jars full of dried petals all over her room. She said she was going to press them all into a book someday, so she could remember every single one. His father had been a soil scientist, studying the way Earth plants adapted to alien worlds. And his mother had been a geneticist working on crop improvements. And both of them had believed deeply in humanity's mission to spread life and growth across the stars through peaceful means. We had a school with 42 students, Danny said. And my best friend was Peter Hayes, whose father ran the maintenance bay for our farming equipment. Peter wanted to be a pilot someday and fly between the stars. He paused, his throat tightening. Peter died when the power station exploded during the first Rokan bombardment. His whole family died there too. Ambassador Bennett had tears running down her face now. But she made no sound and did not interrupt. Because she knew this story had to be told, and it had to be told by Danny himself. The Vroken mercenaries had come in the early morning, their ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel without any warning signals or demands. And their first shots had struck the communications array before anyone even knew they were under attack. The colony had minimal defenses, Danny explained, looking up at Queen Shalara, because human policy for peaceful colonies was to rely on distance and obscurity for protection rather than weapons. We had 2 security officers and a handful of basic weapons for dealing with dangerous wildlife. The attack had been systematic and brutal, with the Vrokans targeting power generators and water treatment facilities first, cutting off escape routes and destroying anything that might let the colonists mount a defense or call for help. The distress signal went out automatically when our shields took damage, Danny said. But the nearest human military ship was 4 days away at maximum speed. We knew help would not come in time. His father had died trying to protect the research computers that held years of agricultural data, shot down by Vroken soldiers who had no interest in anything except the valuable minerals beneath the colony soil. And Danny had watched through a window as his father fell and did not get up again. My mother got 60 children to the underground shelter before the Vrokans breached the main settlement, Danny continued, his voice flat now as he recited facts that still hurt too much to feel. She went back for more, and she was caught in the crossfire when they destroyed the school building. 300 children had made it into the primary shelter, ranging in age from toddlers who barely understood what was happening to teenagers who understood all too well. And with them had come 12 adults who had survived the initial assault. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was there, Danny said. And now he touched the medal on his chest again. He was our military advisor, assigned to the colony to help train security personnel. He had been wounded in the leg, but he could still move. Helen Park had been there too. The primary school teacher, who always wore colorful scarves and who made learning fun even when the subjects were difficult. And Dr. Raymond Cole, who had delivered half the babies in the colony and who always had candy in his pockets for scared children. There were 9 others, Danny said, listing them in his mind, though he did not speak all their names aloud. Farmers and engineers and parents who had lost their own children, but who were determined to save the ones still alive. The shelter had been designed to withstand surface bombardment. Built deep into the bedrock with reinforced walls and independent life support. But it had never been meant to hold against a determined assault by soldiers with cutting equipment. We could hear them cutting through the outer doors, Danny said, and his voice dropped lower as he remembered the sound of plasma cutters burning through metal. Dr. Cole estimated we had maybe 6 hours before they broke through. Lieutenant Morrison had gathered the adults in a corner of the shelter, speaking in low voices while the children huddled together and tried not to cry or make noise that might draw more attention. And Danny had watched them because he had nothing else to do and nowhere else to look. The shelter had an emergency escape tunnel, Danny explained to the council, built as a last resort if the main entrance was compromised. It ran for 3 kilometers underground and came out in the forest beyond the settlement. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through on hands and knees, and it could only be opened from inside the shelter by manual controls that required someone to stay behind and operate them. They argued about who should go, Danny said, remembering the fierce whispers and the way Helen Park had grabbed Morrison's arm, because someone had to go through the tunnel first and come out alone on the surface. The problem was that Vroken scouts had thermal scanners that could detect body heat from a distance, and any adult emerging from the tunnel exit would be spotted immediately and killed or captured before they could signal the children to follow. Lieutenant Morrison said they needed someone small, Danny continued, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Someone whose body heat signature would be low enough to maybe avoid detection by Vroken scanners. The adults had looked at each other and then at the 300 children crowded into the shelter, and the weight of what they were considering had hung in the air like something physical and terrible. They needed a volunteer who could handle a weapon, Danny said, who could think clearly under pressure, who would not panic in the dark or when faced with enemy soldiers. His voice remained steady, but inside he was 10 years old again, watching as Lieutenant Morrison's eyes had scanned the children and then locked onto him with an expression that had held both apology and desperate hope. Morrison chose me, Danny said simply. He said I was the right size, that I had stayed calm during the attack, that I paid attention during his safety lectures about weapons and tactics. Ambassador Bennett made a small sound, quickly suppressed, and several species in the chamber were making gestures that their translators identified as distress or sympathy. I was 10 years old, Danny told Queen Solara. Meeting her eyes directly, I had never fired a real weapon before that day. I had never been more than a kilometer from my parents. I was afraid of the dark, and I hated small spaces, Lieutenant. Morrison had knelt down in front of Danny and explained what needed to happen. His voice calm and steady, as if he were describing something ordinary, instead of sending a child through darkness to face alien soldiers. He gave me a plasma pistol with half a charge left, Danny said. He showed me how to hold it, how to aim, how to make the shot count, because I would not get a second chance. Helen Park had cried silently as she checked Danny's jacket and made sure he had a light attachment and a small medical kit. And Dr. Cole had given him something to swallow that he said would help him stay awake and alert. Katie did not understand why I had to go, Danny said. And now his voice cracked slightly for the first time. She held onto my arm and asked me to stay with her. She said she was scared. He had promised her that he would come back, that he would keep her safe, that everything would be all right. And those lies had felt like knives in his throat. Morrison unpinned his medal and put it on my jacket. Danny continued. Touching the silver medal again, he said I was a soldier now. That I had the most important mission any soldier could have. The 12 adults had embraced him one by one. Each of them knowing they were sending a child to do something the grown warriors might refuse. And each of them knowing they would never see him again because they were planning to stay behind and fight the Vrokans for every second they could buy. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the storage area, Danny said. It was completely dark inside. No lights because they could not risk the Vrokans detecting power usage. He had crawled into that darkness with the weapon strapped to his back and the metal cold against his chest. And behind him he had heard Katie crying and Helen Park's voice singing softly to calm the frightened children. It took me 4 hours to crawl 3 kilometers through absolute darkness, Danny told the council. And his voice had gone flat again, emotionless. The tunnel was too small to turn around in. If I had panicked or given up, there would be no going back. He did not tell them about the times he had stopped, frozen with terror and grief, or about the way he had bitten his lip. The 2 Vrokan guards stood near the tunnel exit, their massive forms towering over the concealed hatch that Danny peered through with one eye pressed against the narrow viewing slot that had been designed for exactly this kind of reconnaissance. They were enormous creatures, easily 3 meters tall with thick scales covering their bodies like natural armor. And they carried weapons that looked like they could punch through vehicle plating without effort. Danny had lain there in the darkness of the tunnel, his small body pressed against the cold metal of the access hatch, watching the guards and trying to remember everything Lieutenant Morrison had taught him in those desperate minutes before he crawled into the darkness. The guards were bored. That much was clear from their body language, as they shifted their weight from foot to foot and occasionally gestured at each other in what might have been conversation. Though Danny could not hear their words through the sealed hatch, I counted their movements, Danny told the council, his voice still steady but his hands trembling at the memory. Morrison had said to watch for patterns, to find the moment when an enemy was least alert. The guards moved in a lazy pattern, walking a few steps in one direction and then turning back, never straying far from the tunnel exit, but also never staying completely still. And their weapons hung loose in their grips, as if they expected no real threat behind Danny in the tunnel. 300 children waited in darkness with 12 adults who were already beginning to hear the sounds of broken soldiers burning through the shelter's final door. And every second that passed was a second closer to discovery and death. I had maybe 2 shots before they could react, Danny explained, looking up at Queen Shalara, whose expression had become unreadable. Morrison said Vrokans have armored bodies, but their eye clusters are vulnerable. He had waited, his breathing shallow, and controlled the way Morrison had shown him, his finger resting beside the trigger of the plasma pistol that felt too heavy in his small hands. The dawn was breaking, Danny said, remembering the way pale light had started to filter through the trees around the tunnel exit. And one of the guards turned his back to scan the forest. That had been the moment Morrison had described, the instant when an enemy's attention was divided and their guard was lowered. And Danny had known with terrible certainty that he would not get another chance. I opened the hatch as quietly as I could, Danny continued, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper that somehow still carried through the silent council chamber. And I raised the weapon the way Morrison showed me. His hands had been shaking so badly that he had to brace the pistol against the edge of the hatch. And his heart had hammered so loudly in his ears that he thought surely the guards must hear it. The first guard never knew what hit him, Danny said flatly. Without pride or satisfaction, I aimed for his eye cluster and I fired. He dropped immediately. The second guard had spun toward the sound of the plasma discharge with speed that should have been impossible for something so large. His weapon already rising, and Danny had known in that split second that he was going to die. I fired again, Danny said. I do not know if I was aiming or just pulling the trigger in panic. The shot hit his neck joint where the armor did not quite connect. The guard had fallen, but not died immediately. And his hand had activated something on his armor that Danny later learned was a distress beacon. A signal that would bring reinforcements within minutes. I climbed out of the tunnel, Danny continued. His voice mechanical now, as he recited facts without letting himself feel them. And I went to the control panel that Morrison had described. I had to step over the bodies to reach it. His hands had been covered in blood by the time he found the right controls. Though he did not know if it was his own blood from cuts and scrapes or blood from the guards. And his entire body had been shaking so hard he could barely press the buttons in the right sequence. The tunnel exit door opened. Danny said, and children started coming out. They crawled up into the daylight, covered in dust and crying, but alive. Helen Park had come out first among the adults, and she had grabbed Danny and checked him for injuries before turning to help organize the children. And her face had been streaked with tears and dust. Morrison had told me what to do next, Danny explained to the council. I had to get the children moving toward the forest, toward a rally point 300 meters away where rescue ships could land if they arrived in time. But the broken distress beacon had already done its work, and Danny had heard the sound of engines approaching fast from the direction of the ruined colony. And he had known with sick certainty that reinforcements were coming. I picked up one of the broken weapons, Danny said, looking at his own small hands as if he could still see them wrapped around that massive rifle. It was too big for me, but I made it work. Dr. Cole had come out of the tunnel and seen Danny with the weapon, and his face had gone pale, but he had not tried to take it away because they both understood that someone needed to provide cover while the children ran. The last children were still climbing out when the broken aircraft appeared over the trees, Danny continued, and his voice remained flat and empty. They came in low and fast, and they started firing before they even landed. He had returned fire with the scavenged weapon, barely controlling its recoil, hitting nothing but buying seconds for the children to scatter into the forest, where the trees would provide some protection. I was hit twice, Danny said, touching his left shoulder where the scar still ached sometimes. The pain did not really register until later. At the time, I just kept firing. Helen Park had been screaming at him to run, and Dr. Cole had been physically dragging the last children away from the exit. And Danny had kept firing until the weapon's charge ran out, and then he had stumbled backward into the trees. The human rescue ships came out of faster-than-light travel directly above us, Danny said. And for the first time, a hint of emotion entered his voice. They had been running at maximum speed since they received our distress signal. They were still 4 hours away when I entered the tunnel. The broken aircraft had broken off their attack immediately, recognizing that they were now facing real military opposition, and they had retreated toward their main ships, which were already preparing to leave the system. I collapsed when I saw our ships, Danny said simply. I remember Katie's face above me. She was holding my hand and crying. Helen Park was trying to stop the bleeding. He had been taken aboard the rescue ship and rushed to the medical bay, where doctors had worked for hours to save his life. And he had woken up 3 days later to learn that all 300 children had survived. The 12 adults died in the shelter, Danny said. And now his voice cracked and broke. They held the Vrokans at the inner door for 4 hours. They used every weapon they could find, and they made the enemy pay for every meter. Lieutenant Morrison had been the last to die. His body found slumped against the door, controls with his weapons still in his hands. And Helen Park and Dr. Cole and all the others had died with him, buying time with their lives. Katie died 6 months later, Danny continued. And tears were running down his face now, though his voice remained steady. She had internal injuries from the attack that we did not discover until it was too late. She died in a hospital on Earth while I was still recovering. His sister had been buried next to their parents in a cemetery for colony victims, and Danny had been the only member of his family left alive to attend the funeral. "This medal belonged to Lieutenant Morrison," Danny said, touching it again with fingers that shook. "He gave it to me before I went into the tunnel. He said I was a soldier, and soldiers needed to be recognized for their service." The council chamber was completely silent now. Even the species that had been making contemptuous sounds earlier were still and quiet, and many of the alien faces showed expressions that their translators identified as grief or respect. "The human military awarded me their own honors," Danny continued. "They gave me decorations for bravery and for saving the children. They held ceremonies and made speeches about heroism." He looked up at Queen Shlara with eyes that were too old for his young face. "But this medal is the only one I wear, because Morrison gave it to me when I was most afraid, and because he and 11 others died so that 300 children could live." Queen Shlara had not moved during Danny's entire explanation, her large eyes fixed on him with an intensity that might have been frightening if Danny had any fear left to give. But now she stirred slightly, and her scales rippled with colors. Danny could not interpret. "You fired on trained soldiers," Queen Shlara said, and her voice had lost its accusatory edge. "You killed enemy combatants as a child of 10 years. "Yes," Danny said simply, because there was no point in denying what had happened and no way to explain that he had not felt like a hero or a soldier, but only like a terrified child who could not let his sister die. "You held position under fire while injured," the Queen continued. "You did not retreat when survival instincts should have demanded flight. The children needed time to get away," Danny said. As if that explained everything, and perhaps it did, Commander Vex stood suddenly in the Predator section of the chamber, his massive form drawing every eye, and he placed his right hand over his chest in what Danny's translator identified as a Ctharian. Queen Shlara remained motionless for several long moments after Danny finished speaking, her large eyes studying the small human boy who stood before her with tears on his face, but his chin still raised. And the entire council chamber held its breath, waiting to see how the powerful ruler would respond. Then slowly, with movements that were both deliberate and unexpectedly graceful, the Queen descended from her elevated position and crossed the chamber floor until she stood directly in front of Danny. Close enough that he had to tilt his head far back to see her face. The chamber erupted in surprised murmurs, because such direct approach was unusual in council proceedings. And Ambassador Bennett started forward instinctively before Elder Mortek raised his hand to stop her. His ancient eyes watching the scene with careful attention, Queen Shlara lowered herself to one knee, bringing her massive head down to Danny's level, and her scales shifted through colors that Danny's translator identified as respect and sorrow, and something deeper that had no direct human equivalent. "I questioned, Your Honor," the Queen said, and her voice resonated through the chamber, but was somehow gentler than before. "I suggested your species falsified valor to gain respect it had not earned." She reached out with one clawed hand, and Danny forced himself not to flinch as those deadly talons came toward him. But the Queen's touch was surprisingly gentle as she straightened the medal on his chest. "I was wrong," Queen Shlara continued, and gasps rippled through the chamber because rulers of the Vakros Empire were not known for admitting error. "By the standards of my people, by the standards of any warrior culture in this galaxy, you have earned this honor and far more." She touched her forehead to Danny's in a gesture that made several species representatives cry out in shock. Because among the Vakros, such contact was reserved for only the most profound shows of respect between warriors of equal standing. "You are not a child," Queen Shlara said, pulling back to look Danny in the eyes. "Perhaps you were once, but you became something else in that tunnel and on that battlefield. You became what your people needed you to be." Danny's throat was too tight to speak, and fresh tears were streaming down his face. But he managed to nod slightly in acknowledgement of her words. Commander Vex strode forward from the Predator section, his heavy footsteps echoing through the chamber. And when he reached Danny and the Queen, he drew a long curved blade from his belt. Ambassador Bennett tensed visibly, and several human delegation members started to rise from their seats. But Elder Mortek signaled them to remain calm with a gesture that his translator rendered as traditional ceremony in progress. Among the Ctharian clans, Commander Vex said, his scarred face showing genuine emotion for the first time, "We give blades to warriors who have proven themselves in combat. This is my personal blade, carried through 12 campaigns." He held the weapon out to Danny with both hands in a formal presentation. "I offer it to you not as a weapon but as a symbol. You have shown courage that would honor any Ctharian warrior, and you did so at an age when our own young are still learning to hold. Practice weapons." Danny took the blade with shaking hands, nearly dropping it because of its weight. And Commander Vex steadied his grip with one massive hand. "The Ctharian clans recognize you as a proven warrior," Commander Vex continued. "And any who speak against your honor will face challenge from us." More beings were approaching now, representatives from species across the chamber, and each brought some gesture of respect or honor according to their own cultural traditions. A delegate from the Peaceful Meridian Collective, a species known for their philosophical wisdom rather than military might, approached with a crystal that glowed with soft blue light. "We Meridians do not honor warriors," the delegate said, their voice musical and sad, "but we honor sacrifice and the protection of innocence. This crystal is a symbol of our highest respect, given to those who place others before themselves." A representative from the Stellar Accord, a coalition of merchant species, offered a ceremonial coin inscribed with symbols that the translator identified as debt beyond measure and honor remembered across generations. "The Accord recognizes that human colonies represent valuable trading partners," the merchant said. "But more than economics, we recognize the value of a species that sends its children into darkness so that other children might live. One by one they came, species that Danny had never heard of before, offering tokens and words and gestures that all carried the same message of respect and recognition. And Danny stood there overwhelmed and uncertain how to respond to such an outpouring. Elder Mortek finally struck his staff against the floor, calling for order and attention. And the chamber gradually fell silent again as beings returned to their seats. "The council has witnessed testimony regarding human military honors," Elder Mortek announced formally. "And we have heard evidence of exceptional valor under circumstances that challenge our understanding of what can be asked of the young." He looked around the chamber, his ancient eyes sweeping across the assembled representatives. "Let it be recorded that the council finds no falsification in human military decorations, and that the honor worn by Danny Carson of Earth is legitimately earned and recognized by this body." The chamber erupted in sounds that translators struggled to categorize, but which generally indicated agreement and approval. And Elder Mortek had to strike his staff several more times before order was restored. Furthermore, Elder Mortek continued, "The Council acknowledges that attacks on human colony worlds have resulted in extraordinary suffering and have forced impossible choices upon civilians, including children." His voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of formal decree. "By unanimous consent of all voting species present, attacks upon human colonies are hereby elevated to the highest category of war crimes. And any species or entity found guilty of such attacks will face the combined military response of all Council member nations." Ambassador Bennett's face showed shock and then overwhelming relief, because such a declaration was unprecedented and meant that humanity's scattered and vulnerable colonies would now be protected by the combined might of the galaxy's established powers. The broken mercenary company responsible for the attack on Earth Colony 7, Elder Mortek continued, is hereby declared enemy to all civilized species, and their assets are forfeit under council law. Several species representatives immediately activated their communication devices, sending messages that would result in broken ships being hunted across the galaxy within hours. Queen Shlara stood and addressed the chamber, her voice carrying authority that made even Elder Mortek pause. The Vakros Empire proposes an additional measure. Let humanity's colony worlds receive protection forces from volunteer species until such time as humanity can establish adequate defenses of their own. The Therian clans volunteer our warriors for this purpose, Commander Vex announced immediately. We will consider it an honor to stand guard over beings who protect their young with such determination. More species representatives stood to offer military assistance, and within minutes, a protection plan was forming that would place dozens of human colonies under the watchful guard of experienced galactic powers. Danny stood in the center of the chamber, forgotten temporarily in the flurry of diplomatic activity, and he felt the weight of all the honors he'd been given pressing down on him like a physical burden. He looked at the Therian blade in his hands and the crystal from the meridians in the ceremonial coin and all the other tokens, and he thought about Lieutenant Morrison and Helen Park and Dr. Cole and the 9 others who had died in the shelter. They should have these, Danny said quietly, but his voice carried in a brief moment of silence. The adults who died. They are the real heroes. I just did what they told me to do. The chamber fell completely silent again, and Queen Shlara turned to look at Danny with an expression that might have been understanding. You speak their names, the Queen said. You remember them when others might forget. This too is a form of honor. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, Danny said, his voice growing stronger. Helen Park, Dr. Raymond Cole, Michael Grant, Susan Walker, David Lee, Patricia Stone, Robert Kim, Jennifer Murphy, William Chun, Lisa Taylor, and John Martinez. He repeated the names slowly and clearly so that every being in the chamber could hear them through their translators. They died buying time for 300 children to escape. They knew they would not survive, but they fought anyway. Ambassador Bennett was crying openly now, and many other beings in the chamber showed signs of emotional response. Those names will be recorded in council archives, Elder Mortek said gently, and they will be remembered as the humans who taught the galaxy what true courage means. Danny nodded, clutching the Therian blade and the other honors. Katie Carson, he added softly, my sister. She survived the attack, but she died 6 months later. She was 8 years old, and she loved flowers. Katie Carson will also be remembered, Queen Shlara said, and there was genuine gentleness in her voice now. All of the lost will be honored. Elder Mortek struck his staff one final time. This session is concluded, he announced. The Council's decrees will be transmitted to all member species within the hour. As beings began to leave the chamber, many stopped to speak briefly with Danny or to touch his shoulder in gestures of respect. The hours after the council session passed in a blur of activity that Danny watched as if from a great distance. His mind still caught somewhere between the present moment and those terrible hours in the tunnel. 18 months before Ambassador Bennett had taken him to a quiet room away from the main diplomatic areas, and she had sat with him while he processed everything that had happened. Her presence steady and calm, even though she kept having to step away to answer urgent communications from Earth and from human colonies across the galaxy. The news of the Council's decision was spreading faster than light-speed communications could travel, carried by ships jumping through faster than light routes and by the galaxy's vast network of relay stations. And within hours, every species in known space would know that humanity's colonies were now under Council protection. You changed everything today, Ambassador Bennett said softly, sitting across from Danny in the small room where he cradled the Therian blade and the other honors he had been given. The Council has never moved so quickly to protect a new species. Before, Danny looked at the honors in his hands and felt no pride. Only a deep weariness that made his bones ache. I just told them what happened, he said quietly. I did not mean to change anything. Sometimes the truth is enough, Bennett replied. Sometimes people just need to understand what is really at stake. She had explained that protection forces were already being organized, with Ktharian warriors volunteering in such numbers that Commander Vex had to establish selection criteria, and that the Vakros Empire had pledged 3 full battle groups to patrol human space. Dozens of other species were offering support ranging from military assistance to medical supplies to educational programs for orphan children. And the human government was scrambling to coordinate the sudden influx of aid and attention. Earth Colony 7 will have a memorial, Bennett told Danny. The Council has authorized funds to build something permanent on the site, and survivors from the colony are working with architects to design it. Danny's hands tightened on Marston's medal. Will it have their names? He asked, meaning the 12 adults who died in the shelter. All of their names, Bennett confirmed, and Katie's name too, and everyone else who died that day. No one will be forgotten. She paused, watching Danny's face. You could speak at the dedication ceremony if you want to, but no one expects you to do anything more than you have already done. Danny thought about standing in front of crowds and giving speeches, and the idea made him feel sick and tired. I just want to visit, he said finally. I want to tell Katie that I kept my promise. You can do that, Bennett said gently. The memorial site will be open to survivors first. Before any public ceremony, there was a soft chime at the door, and Bennett rose to answer it, speaking quietly with whoever was outside before turning back to Danny. Queen Shlara is here. She asks if she can speak with you privately. Danny felt a flutter of nervousness, but he nodded, and Bennett stepped outside as the massive Vakros ruler entered the small room. Having to duck her head to fit through the doorway designed for smaller species, Queen Shlara settled herself on the floor, since the room's furniture would not support her weight. And she regarded Danny with those large, unblinking eyes that seemed to see more than most beings could perceive. I wanted to apologize properly, the Queen said, away from the council chamber and political theater. I challenge your honor in front of the galaxy, and I did so from ignorance and prejudice. You did not know, Danny said, because he held no anger toward her or toward anyone, except perhaps the Vrokans who had destroyed his home and his family. That is not an excuse. Queen Shlara replied, a ruler should seek to understand before passing judgment. I saw a child with a medal, and I assumed deception rather than considering that perhaps human children are capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. She was quiet for a moment, her scales shifting through colors that Danny was beginning to recognize as thoughtfulness. My own people sent young warriors into battle in our early history, she continued. We stopped the practice because we found that victory purchased with the lives of our children was too bitter to celebrate. Danny understood what she was trying to say. I do not think humans will make it a habit, he said softly. What happened at Colony 7 was desperation, not strategy. I know that now, the Queen said, and I will make certain that the other species understand it as well. Humanity does not seek war, but you will endure anything to protect your young. She reached into a pouch at her side and withdrew a small object that gleamed with an inner light. This is a personal gift, not a diplomatic token, she said, offering it to Danny. It is a memorial stone from the Vakros homeworld. We carve names into these stones to remember our honored dead. Danny took the stone carefully, feeling its weight and warmth. Thank you, he said, meaning it sincerely. Will you carve their names yourself? Or would you like me to have it done for you? Queen Shlara asked. I will do it myself, Danny said after a moment. I think I need to. I think it will help me remember them properly. The queen nodded her massive head in approval. "That is a warrior's choice," she said. "To carry the weight of memory rather than setting it aside." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while. And then Queen Shlora asked the question that Danny knew was coming, but had been dreading anyway. "What will you do now, young warrior?" Danny looked down at Morrison's medal and thought about the future that stretched ahead of him. Empty of family but full of possibilities that he did not feel ready to consider. "Ambassador Bennett says there is a school on Earth for survivors," he said slowly. "Children who lost their families in various attacks and incidents. She thinks I would do well there. And after school?" The queen prompted gently. "I do not know," Danny admitted. "Sometimes I think I should join the colonial defense. Learn to protect other colonies, so what happened to us does not happen to anyone else." He paused, his fingers tracing the edges of the metal. "But sometimes I think I should become an engineer like my father wanted. Build things instead of destroy them. Both are worthy paths," Queen Shlora said, "and you have time to choose. Despite what happened to you, you are still young and the future is not yet written." "I do not feel young," Danny said quietly. "I have not felt young since the tunnel." The queen's scales rippled with a color that the translator identified as deep sadness. "That is perhaps the greatest tragedy of what happened," she said. "Not just the deaths, but the theft of innocence from those who survived." She rose to her feet, preparing to leave. "But hear me, Danny Carson. You survived for a reason, and 300 children live because you were brave when you had every reason to be paralyzed with fear. You think there is purpose in suffering?" Danny asked, and his voice held a note of bitterness that was rare for him. "I think there is purpose in survival," Queen Shlora corrected gently. "What you do with the life you have been given. The life that Morrison and the others bought for you with their sacrifice. That will be your purpose." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back. "I hope you will consider visiting the Vacross homeworld someday. Our young warriors would benefit from meeting you and understanding that true courage comes not from seeking battle, but from facing it when there is no other choice." After she left, Danny sat alone with his thoughts and the honors he had received, and he realized that he was tired of being in this room. Tired of thinking about the past and about choices he could not change. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the vast space station that surrounded him with its thousands of inhabitants from hundreds of worlds. And beyond the station, he could see the stars stretching away in all directions. Somewhere out there was Earth, the world his parents had come from and where he would go to attend school. And somewhere out there were the ruins of Colony 7, where a memorial would be built somewhere. Out there were 300 survivors, children who were now scattered across the galaxy, but who shared the bond of that terrible day, and the adults who had saved them. Danny touched Morrison's medal one more time and made a promise to himself. A promise that echoed the one he had made to Katie before entering the tunnel. He would not waste a life that had been bought at such terrible cost. He would find a way to make the sacrifice mean something beyond grief and loss. Maybe he would join the colonial defense and learn to protect other worlds from what had happened to his home. Or maybe he would become an engineer and help build colonies that could defend themselves. Or maybe he would do something completely different, something that Morrison and his parents and Katie could not have imagined, but something that would honor their memory by making the galaxy a little bit safer or kinder or better. The door opened again, and Ambassador Bennett stepped inside. "There are about a dozen more species representatives who want to meet you," she said with a tired smile, "but I have been holding them off. You have had enough for one day." "Thank you," Danny said, meaning it deeply. "There is a transport leaving for Earth tomorrow." Bennett continued, "If you want to start at that school we discussed, I can arrange for you to be on it." Danny nodded slowly. "I think I would like that," he said. "I think I need to be around other kids who understand what it is like to lose everything." "The school is good," Bennett assured him.